I'm here today with Dr. Nell Irvin Painter, an American historian, scholar, author, and you guessed it, a painter. She led the Afro American Studies program at Princeton University for a number of years, and I'm honored to be in conversation with you today, Dr. Painter.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I encountered your work through the book, The History of White People. I've spoken about that on my platforms a few times. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. That's kind of the context of our conversation today. So my first question for you is what is whiteness?
What is whiteness depends on when you ask, who you're talking to, when, and where. Because the thing that we need to remember is that whiteness, like other identities, social identities, change. Whiteness changes with the time and the place and the everything around it. So what's harder for people to understand is that whiteness or race generally, because this goes for blackness and brownness and everything, these are ideologies. It's a belief system. And in that belief system is the core that says this is physical, this is biological, this is unchanging, and this links you to the people that I say it links you to. So the core of the ideology is this is scientific truth, but it's an ideology. Now, I want to separate the ideology of race from the physical and material and psychological consequences of racism. Racism costs people money, time, mental health, places to live, places to go safely. And in the 19th, 18th, and 17th centuries, it costed people freedom. So racism is not the same as race. Race is an ideology. Racism is material.
You mentioned that it depends, the kind of definition of that idea, this ideology really depends on time, that, where are we in history? And so my question is what were like I don't even know what to call them. What were lighter skinned people, European people? What were they before they were white?
They belonged to a king or a warlord or a place or the um, the territory. Was it high? Was it low? Mountainous? Was it rainy? All of those ways, or also religion. Religion is a really big way of othering people.
That's really, really interesting. When you talk about geography, what triggers is there are ideas that, depending upon if I'm understanding correctly, specifically within the Greek frame, there were ideas that based on where you lived geographically, whether it was cold or hot, north or south, that determined your beauty and your intelligence. Is there any, how does that intersect here?
Well, what you're talking about is how Herodotus, the father of history, talked about other people, and so he thought that people who lived in boggy places had kind of boggy bellies, and they didn't move around. He thought the Greeks were the example of wonderful people who lived in mountainous territory, and they were very energetic and smart. So where you lived had to do with how you were, according to Herodotus. Um, we can think of this kind of association of place with people's identity when we think about North and South in the United States. So, for instance, Alexis de Tocqueville, and I urge people to read both volumes of Alexis de Tocqueville, talked about the difference in Americans, and what he meant were white American men, in the free states and the slave states. And he thought that the Americans in the free states were energetic and enterprising, and They were what we would think of as good little capitalists. But the people in the slave states, again, we're talking about white men, were touchy and they couldn't stick to stuff and they were flighty and then they were prone to violence. So that's another way of associating place with identity.
I think one of the things that stood out to me as I was reading your book, The History of White People, is the way that, there's a saying that's been on my mind a lot lately, and I can't figure out who said it, but history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes is the saying.
Oh, no.
And,
Why
and
not?
why not? And as you're describing that, I'm hearing a little bit of that rhyming happening
Mhm.
between way back when and today, and some of the predilections and preconceptions that we have about people based on where they live and their skin color. But I'm also wondering, are there any notable traditions or cultural elements that ethnic groups from before whiteness was derived, or this ideology?
Before race
Yeah, before.
science.
Precise.
Yeah.
Before race science,
hmm
precisely.
hmm
Are there any ethnic or cultural traditions that have survived?
Yes.
Okay, please tell me. I'm very curious.
Religion.
Okay.
Religion is longstanding, dangerous, but it nourishes many people. But that is the classic way that people decided who was them and who was other people. And remember, just to think of the Europeans had a 30 years war, and it was all about different kinds of Christianity. It was about Protestants and Catholics.
Could you say more about white identity and the formation, the founding ideas of white identity, and what it means to be white?
How long do you have?
We have all day. Please, just
Yeah.
say it all. We'll cut it
I
down
think
if
that
need be.
it's about time and place. So, for instance, when I started working on the history of white people, it's like 20 years ago. It's a long time ago. It was longer than a lot of Americans have been alive. And at that time, the term Caucasian for white people was current. I mean, it wasn't an everyday word, but people used Caucasian when they wanted to talk about white people in a kind of serious, scientific way. And to call white people white was like an insult because naming white was like saying white nationalists and Klansmen and other kinds of murderous people. So the very current, I mean, white now is used in regular conversation all the time. And 2 decades ago, it wasn't. It was bad manners to talk about white because white people were individuals. And it was okay to use black because black people had race, but white people didn't have race. White people were individuals. They had their ethnicity, they had their homelands, they had their neighborhoods, but they didn't have race.
And is there a point in history? I'm always looking for the smoking gun. Is there a point in history where we see the proliferation, this wide acceptance of white identity, even if it wasn't in name, this idea of pan kind of European white identity? Is there a point in history when that was widely accepted?
Yes, the Second World War.
Hmm.
That's when, let's see. So I don't want to get too deep into US history here, but remember the 20th century, and we had a Great Depression, and we had a big war. And before that, we had Nazis in the United States and Nazis in Germany. And the Nazis in Germany were doing really bad things in the name of race. And they were talking about race. And when they said race, they were talking about people who adhered to a religion, Judaism. Nazis racialized Jewish people, racialized Jews, and had a whole panoply of negative stereotypes attached to that boogeyman. I guess that's the best. It's worse than a boogeyman because what the Nazis did was murderous. So many white Americans, including scientists, had advanced ideas that they now saw in Nazi German discourse. And they said, oh my God, this is terrible. So many white people, here I'll just talk about scientists and academics, and I'm not talking about Klansmen here. I'm talking about respectable scientists, recoiled from what they had wrought. So that was part of it. Another part of it was the Great Depression, when Americans needed to pull together, not to be divided by various races. And when I say various races, we need to understand that in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the correct way to think about white people was as the races, plural, of Europe. So what we understand that there's one big white race and everybody's in it, and this one and that one, you're all equally white. And if people came from Europe, they had to become white in the United States. This is not the way people understood in the 19th and early 20th centuries. There were many white races. So, for instance, in the 19th century, in Ralph Waldo Emerson's 19th century, there was the Saxon race, to which he thought he belonged, or Teutonic race. And there was the Celtic race, which was Irish people, who were very downtrodden in the United States in the 19th century. And then at the turn of the 20th century, with new immigrants, people from Southern and Eastern Europe. So those people were recognized as white. So in the census, they were recognized as white. But in science, they were recognized as the Northern Italian race, or the Southern Italian race, or the Slavic race, or the Jewish race. So there were all these different European races. They were all different kinds of white people, different kinds of white races. But with the Second World War, we had a greater need for national unity, and also looking back at the Nazis and saying, no, wait, there's not a whole bunch of white races. There's just one white race, and there's one black race, which is Negroid, and there's one Asian race, who's the Mongoloid. There are only three real races. And that is from the 1940s. So we look to the 1940s for one big white race. That wasn't enough. So by the 1970s, we get ethnicity. We get white ethnics. And so you could be proud of being Irish, you could be proud of being Italian, you could be proud of being Greek, but that wasn't a race. Only Black people had race. So we're getting into different ways of living and positioning yourself, seeing yourself in culture and popular culture and the movies and so forth. So the short answer to your question is the 1940s.
Yeah. Wow. Oh, thank you for that. That's really, really helpful. I think maybe the 1940s would be on a number of people's minds today as the film Oppenheimer is quite popular right now.
Yes.
And so I watched it over the weekend and thought a lot about race as I was watching them build
I
a
haven't
bomb.
seen it.
Yeah.
I've read about it, and I understand that anti-Semitism is faced. And so we need to remember that the invention of one big white race didn't get rid of anti-Semitism.
That's right. And to your point, there is quite a great deal of discourse in the film about Oppenheimer being a Jewish man and his community and some of that. And the opportunities present for Jewish Americans being significantly limited,
Yes.
as
Yes.
really, as
Yes.
compared to their, white counterparts. Who even knows
Gentile.
what that means,
There's a
right?
word
Those
for it, Gentile.
Gentile. There it is. Great, great. I have a couple of questions in
Mhm.
my notes here that that I found I found it really difficult to find segues to. So they're a bit random, and I'm just going to ask them. But
Okay.
I think there's actually a moment here for this. You
Mhm.
mentioned Celtic people or Irish people.
Yes.
I make content related to race on the internet, and
Mhm.
as I talk about race, inevitably someone in my comments will admonish me, scold me for failing to properly acknowledge that Irish people were slaves in America before Black people were slaves.
Well,
Now,
that's wrong. That is
Google
wrong.
seems to debunk that.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's totally true. So I want to ask you as a
Yeah.
historian.
Yeah.
Let's get to the bottom of that.
Yeah. Sure. Irish people and vulnerable English people, Scottish people, Welsh people, poor people, people considered criminals or orphans, were often shipped outside of the British Isles to places like what became the United States, what later became Australia and New Zealand, and as indentured workers. And in fact, the first Africans who came to what became the United States were also indentured workers. I wrote a piece for The Guardian in 2019 about don't don't call them African slaves because the African captives of 1619 were shipped, and they were a very small part of the population of Virginia at the time. And there were lots and lots of unfree white people, but their unfreedom had a term limit. So the indenture meant that if you survived your indenture, and many, many, many people did not survive, then you could become a free person. You could buy and sell. You could go into business. You could have your little farm, and so on and so forth. So yes, many early North American white people were unfree, but they were not enslaved for life. It took the colonies, the North American colonies, several decades to go from indentures for people of African descent, for Africans and their descendants, to permanent enslavement. It didn't happen overnight. The people whom warlords had rounded up in places like what is now Angola and sold to Europeans who then shipped them across the ocean. Those people were, it was their descendants who became permanently enslaved. So by the end of the 17th century, the 1600s, what we recognize as permanent servitude and chattel slavery was in place. And it did not include people we now consider white.
Right, right. That kind of comes becomes clear, I think, in your book that, in my understanding, even if this is just a distillation, our kind of understanding of this pan-European white identity really has some of its origins in the slave trade and making a differentiation between white, those who are not enslaved for life, though could be indentured,
Yes,
and black, those
yeah,
who are
yeah,
enslaved for
yeah.
life.
But again, we're talking about place too,
Mm,
because in Boston, for instance, Emerson's Boston of the middle of the 19th century, people thought about race differently. They had many, they were not so much in the thrall of dealing with blackness and oppressing blackness, so they could oppress the Celtic race, for instance. But in the South, where that line between slavery and freedom in the 18th century, very sharp and permanent.
how do we understand black identity in contrast or in relationship to white identity?
Depends on who's talking, when and where, to whom, and for what purpose. So, for instance, when I was a young person in the 20th century, there was just one kind of white people and one kind of black people. My family was from Texas and Louisiana, and we were black people. That was black people. In the 20th century, um, until the very, very end, the overwhelming proportion of people considered black or Negro or colored were American born, of American born parents, of American born grandparents. Today, I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but you can't talk about black people in this monolithic way because so many people are either immigrants or the children of immigrants or the grandchildren of immigrants. So I remember talking to my students at Princeton about identity and black identity. And so everybody said, yeah, we're African Americans. And I remember when that term came into use, but for them it was permanent. We're African Americans. And I said, well, how many of you have parents or grandparents who were born outside of the United States? And a whole bunch of people raised their hands. How many of you are yourselves immigrants? And some people raised their hands. I said, well, what do you call yourself? And so people kind of scratched their heads and said, okay, African Americans.
I I think there is a growing conversation in some circles around who get to this day who gets to identify as African American. I there you are likely familiar with the work of Dr. Darity, William Darity, and the ADOS community and those who want to adopt that name. I have you here, so I have to ask you, what are your thoughts on terms like ADOS as you've seen the evolution of nomenclature for Black people change over
It's
time?
not up to me. If that's what they want to call themselves that. We live in a big country. Our culture is on various levels in various places. And as long as people can convince other people to use their name, that's their name. Even if they don't want to convince other people, that's okay too. Um, I remember, I was brought up as a capital N Negro. So for me, Negro is not a bad word as long as you capitalize it. And I remember when Black became popular, I used Black. And I remember when I capitalized Black and then we uncapitalized Black. I remember being caught up talking about Black people when somebody in an audience said, no, that's not the right term. The right term is African Americans. It's okay. But I use Black because it's a general word that can include African Americans and Caribbean African Americans and half African Americans. It's just a good, vague, general word.
Yeah. Yeah, there is something very nice about the vagueness of
Mhm,
Black that
mhm,
is inclusive in a way.
mhm. So
Um,
now I capitalize Black, but I also capitalize white.
okay.
Yeah.
Why is that? I'm very curious why that
Yeah,
is.
I capitalize white to remind people that white is a forged identity as contingent as Black. We've been talking about the contingencies within Black, and we've also been talking about the contingencies within white. Neither group is scientific, neither group is solid. Both groups are full of different kinds of people who would probably stab each other's in the back. Both groups have really dumb brothers-in-law, so um, neither group is homogeneous. But we know what we mean when we use those words.
There is a discussion that certainly has been around since before I've been around about collectivism and individualism.
Hmm.
Whiteness is seen as an individualistic
Yes,
identity,
yes,
while blackness is often seen as collectivistic
yes.
in its kind of
Hmm.
identification of self.
Hmm.
Um, I don't have a question here. This isn't something I've written down, but I want to know your thoughts there and the value of those two ways of thinking about oneself or one's
Hmm.
group.
Well, I think for one thing, the commonplace, and it is a commonplace, that Americans are individualistic, meaning white Americans are individualistic, really has to do more with men than with women, for one thing. But also, I think there is something to it, to the relationship between those two identities. And I think the embrace, I mean, Black people have, we have had our community, our groupness imposed on us from the outside, as well as embracing it from the inside. It's embracing it from the inside gives you a kind of source of understanding yourself and the world, a source of support. It means that when you do stupid things, it's not just your fault. So there's a lot to be said for Blackness from inside and from outside. Whereas white people who think of themselves as just individuals are thrown out in the world by themselves. So, it's a much more dangerous position to be in. But I think that the idea of individualistic Americans or white people is an identity forged against the communal identity of Black people. I mean, when you look around at the way states, for instance, talk to or define the races, there would be all these little distinctions about who is Black, and white's just the leavings. And so, in that sense, I think white individualism is kind of one of the leavings of Blackness. And I think, and I just wrote about this in the introduction to my collection of essays coming out next year. I just keep talking, and as you see, I do just keep talking. That the the group identity, the sense of community is a strength of Black people, which I wish more Americans had, of seeing yourself in relationship to the people around you, of seeing what happens to you as impinging on or helping other people, of forging politics and policies that work for more than just oneself or one's family. Maybe I'm talking like a socialist here, but I think solidarity is a very good thing. And I wish more Americans had a sense of solidarity.
I resonate with that, Dr. Painter. I think, there was so much I learned, I'll say it this way. I learned about so many unarmed white men and women who were killed by the police in
Yes,
2020
yes,
as a response to the outpouring of support for Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and
yeah,
Ahmaud Arbery by the Black community. It was almost like I was hearing white people or people who identify and see themselves as white say, well, how come? And many times the response from Black people were like, well, you didn't say anything. You didn't call us to action, and we're calling you to action
exactly.
here. And so I
Yes,
think you're spot on that developing that kind of communal identity could be really powerful,
yes,
especially for solidarity movements like the
yes.
movement for lives and against police brutality.
Yes, absolutely. And I thought that way too in 2020. And it turns out, since there are still more white people than Black people in the United States, the police and law enforcement kill more white people than Black people. I wouldn't say that white people need to do White Lives Matter. I mean, that's a whole thorny ball there. But that the people who are concerned about policing and community policing and police brutality should get together across lines of race and ethnicity to talk about what we need to be safe in our communities, in our states, and in our country.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. I'm excited for your book. I have just a couple more questions here, and then we'll wrap our time up together. You've mentioned how whiteness and who's included in whiteness has evolved over time. I want to kind of bring our conversation more present, which I think it's moved to very naturally. Do you anticipate a continued broadening of who is able to identify as white today as happened in the past?
Yes, and it's been happening. We know for census purposes, and the census is a political document, it is not scientific. It's about how the government works. But people see that as sort of how they decide to think about themselves. So we have something called ethnicity, that is Latino, not Latino, or Hispanic, not Hispanic, and race, which is black, white, and other places. I mean, it's kind of a hodgepodge. Some races are associated with places like Pacific Islander, and some are associated with old time identities like black and white. But over the course of the last 20, 30 years, more and more people who had been, or still are, because you can do both, you can do both ethnicity and race, are ethnically Latino or Hispanic and racially white. People often ask me, will we ever get rid of race? And I have two answers to that. One is no, because it's foundational to American identity and American politics and American society and culture. But if we ever do, what will replace it will be terrible, like religion as a way of othering and killing other people, and colorism. So that it will be less what your race is and more what color you are. And so lighter skinned people will be better off in the world than darker skinned people. And when you add class to that and you make lighter skinned richer people and darker skinned poor people, then you have something that is not the same as black, white race, but that is an evolution of it.
Yeah. To your point about a lot of these things, all of these things being foundational to American identity,
Mhm.
we're having a national conversation about history these days and the role that history is to play. We're
Yes.
seeing an incredible attack, from my perspective, on history across the country, but notably in places like I think Texas and Florida kind of come to
Yeah.
mind.
Yeah.
And
It's not
often,
incredible. It's very credible, and it's happened
mm,
before.
mm, you beat me to the question, so answer it.
Yeah.
When has this happened before, and how? Please give us some examples.
Okay. In the 20th century, in the 1950s, in the Cold War, the Lavender Scare, anti-gay and lesbian, anti-communist. People lost their jobs and their livelihoods because they had been targeted as communists or fellow travelers. So there's that. But when we think of the really awful stuff, just go back to the segregation of South, for instance, where looking at how much money states spent on educating black kids as opposed to educating white kids. Black kids got, hand-me-down stuff. And, I mean, some of this still happens, of course. This is not over. But it was so stark and so mean and so cruel in the 20th century. But if you want a time of bloodshed and terrorism, look at the end of the 19th century after Reconstruction. You can read my book, Exodusters, about the terrorism that ended Reconstruction, or the 1850s. And let me just say one last thing. When we think about how awful things can be and how divided Americans are, we can look back at the 1850s, which were just, a time of, well, it led to the Civil War. But there also were committed people, black and white, who call themselves abolitionists. And they really started being heard, but they also were being mobbed in the 1830s. They were very unpopular in places like Philadelphia and New York. I mean, we're talking about terrorism in Philadelphia and New York, anti-abolitionist. But abolitionists kept at it, and without them, there would not have been emancipation. So do something.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. That so many thoughts here. What you're, if I'm understanding correctly, what you're talking about at the end of the 19th century, is that the the great racial nadir? Is that the
Yes,
term?
the nadir, yes.
Nadir. Thank you.
And okay, what's his name? Rayford Logan at Howard University called that post Reconstruction period the nadir. I never did agree with it. I actually knew Rayford Logan a little bit. I didn't tell him I didn't agree with him. He was not a person you could disagree with. But I always thought that slavery was the nadir. And as Black Studies produces all this wonderful pouring, this intellectual outpouring, we see how much was going on. We see how much organizing, writing, educating, moving, dressing up, going out, all these things were going on. It's true that it was in very straitened circumstances. People had very little room to maneuver, and doing the wrong thing or being seen or thought of as doing the wrong thing could get you killed in very nasty ways. But a lot was going on.
This is my last question that I couldn't figure out a way to work into the natural flow of the conversation, but it's about your work around Sojourner Truth. Love that work. Of course, you are the scholar. You were instrumental in bringing Sojourner Truth's real speech to the fore, making it kind of widely known that the speech known as "Ain't I a Woman" speech. I don't think she ever used those words,
She did
and
not. You don't have to say, I think. She did
she
not.
never used those
She
words.
didn't say, aren't I a woman, which is in the written version, which got fixed into ain't because aren't didn't sound black enough or something.
Yep.
Yes, I have been on the warpath for a quarter of a century about that.
Okay. Well, I'm very happy to tell you that I made a video about this very thing that did
Oh,
really well. It a lot of people saw it, which
good.
and I even got messages from school teachers. I released it in March a couple of years ago,
Mhm.
and I got messages from school teachers who were like, "I never knew this, and I'm changing my lesson plan tomorrow because I was covering
Good.
Sojourner Truth for Women's History Month, and
Yes.
now we're changing what we're going to
Yeah.
talk about." So
Yeah.
it's been very
I
effective.
have three things to say about that. One, as we speak, I'm writing a new book on Sojourner Truth called Sojourner Truth Was a New Yorker, and She Didn't Say That. The second thing is that even though Sojourner Truth didn't say that, Sojourner Truth was a great American. And we need to appreciate her for being someone who was on the lecture circuit, who stood up, who was seen and heard, who was intelligent and eloquent. She was a great American. We just don't have to quote unquote quote her. And what I would like people to do when they want to recognize Sojourner Truth is not to go to the slogan, but to go to even a brief version of her life. She was born enslaved in New York. She freed herself. She got her son back from illegal perpetual slavery. She became an abolitionist. She was the only woman who had been enslaved who was able to persevere in public for decades talking about women's rights, anti-slavery, and freedmen's rights. She was a great American. And when you want to talk about her, talk about what she means to you.
Hmm. Powerful Dr. Nell Irvin Painter. It has been an absolute pleasure
Good, thank
to
you.
be in conversation with you. Would you tell us a little bit more about some of your upcoming work and how we can continue to follow what you're doing?
Yes, well, I am on Instagram. So I don't post every day, but every other day sometimes. And the things that I'm going to do. Uh, so that's the easiest way. I also have a website which has lots of stuff in it. It has different parts to it. One part is Nell Irvin Painter, historian. Another part is Nell Painter, visual artist. So the website is there. I mentioned the book I'm working on, Sojourner Truth, was a New Yorker, and she didn't say that. I have a book in press with Doubleday that will come out in March or April 2024. It's a collection of essays, which also includes my art, and it's called I Just Keep Talking. And I'm thinking about maybe doing something autobiographical after that, like my 60s elsewhere, because I spent the 1960s out of the country a lot. And 2 years were in Ghana, in West Africa. And I have said very often that if I am at all sane, it's because of those years elsewhere.
Hmm. Powerful. I can't, all three of those sound absolutely amazing.
Thank you.
Again, can't say thank you enough for your time. Very much appreciated.
You're so welcome.